Judith, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us. I saw the article that you've written about how these various parties, especially the major protagonists, are positioning themselves around the issue of corruption. But the nub of the matter, before we just look at each and every one of them, the ANC, the governing party, the DA that's governing in the Western Cape, the EFF that's got aspirations to govern and is in coalition in some metros, before we do that, just overall, you make the point that while they are saying the right things, it seems that the implementation of anti-corruption plans is not really great.
Well, good morning, Dan. Well, we've seen that the implementation of anti-corruption plans haven't been that great. South Africa actually doesn't have a bad anti-corruption framework. The one area where we do come down is obviously on regulation of private funding to political parties. There is an act which has been passed, but it hasn't yet been implemented. And for the longest time, that was this lacuna or the vacuum in our law with regard to anti-corruption legislation. There are always ways in which one can strengthen the law, but it always is about two things. The first is about implementation, but also about those in power who are they willing to subject themselves to those laws when they apply, and also our demand for accountability and transparency within government. That is very important. So laws themselves won't solve our problem, and that, I think, is also the point that I was trying to make in the article.
Okay, now the manifestos of the ANC, the DA and the EFF, they all say different things ahead of this election around corruption. Cyril Ramaphosa promising a cleanup.
That's correct. President Ramaphosa has gone across the country talking about this cleanup. It's quite obvious that corruption is a major theme in this election. The ANC has never looked as weak on this issue, given the 9 wasted years, and President Ramaphosa was correct when he said that. The Zuma years were really all about self-aggrandizement for former President Zuma, his associates, and criminal and corrupt acts. And we are beginning to see the depth of that through the Zondo Commission and other commissions of inquiry. And so rightfully, Ramaphosa is trying to separate himself, albeit with some difficulty, from the ANC and what the corruption, not only by President Zuma, cabinet ministers, but also within municipalities and within provinces. And so it is understandable that he would talk about this cleanup. The question, of course, always is around credibility, legitimacy, and so on. I have no doubt that President Ramaphosa believes these words, but of course he has a party that he needs to clean out, and there are question marks as to whether he can in fact do that. And then of course he has to clean out the state. So that is a very tall order. But Dan, the ANC talks about corruption in very broad strokes, so strengthening the criminal procedure apparatus, trying to put in place lifestyle audits. We've heard about lifestyle audits for quite a long time, and I do think that that would be one area where the President, after May 8, could focus, depending, of course, on the strength of his victory.
Well, the DA, of course, we've seen it coming out against corruption, but they do so by pointing out the ANC's failings since they've been in government with all those kind of allegations.
Yes, and the DA runs on clean, honest government. That is what they're saying is separating them from other parties, particularly the ANC. Given the ANC's abysmal record, that's not really hard to do. But, for example, in the Western Cape and so on, there has been generally clean government. There have been allegations around Patricia de Lille, and we still don't have clarity on those. But that aside, it has generally tried to operate on clean government. The DA's manifesto is also quite general, but rather looking at the different sectors. So cash for employment, for example, looking at corruption and land reform, a particular focus on state-owned enterprises. And so it is broad in terms of its sectoral reach, and yes, it tries to distinguish itself from the ANC in those ways, and also looking at ways to strengthen, obviously, the criminal justice system.
Well, talking about strengthening the justice system, the EFF, for its part, is calling, for example, for changes to the Constitution to make the National Prosecuting Authority a Chapter 9 institution.
Yes, and in fact, Dan, it's quite interesting because the EFF have got some of the more interesting suggestions. For example, the one you've just mentioned, and also 20 years imprisonment for people who are caught with corruption, state administration courts to try and get those corruption, those who have been accused of corruption, to try and get them through the system more quickly. They are looking at strengthening whistleblower protection. And I mean, these are things that within civil society we talk about all the time. So they've quite cleverly appropriated some of that language. But of course, Dan, I think with all of these things, it is again a credibility and a legitimacy issue. Does the EFF, in fact, have the credibility or the legitimacy to talk about anti-corruption issues, given the VBS scandal, given that Julius Malema has a cloud of corruption hanging over his head, and there were recent allegations from a disgruntled party member too. And so really they have important questions to answer. But of course, part of its cachet has been that it is a party that fights corruption. It fought against Jacob Zuma regarding Nkandla. It raises the issue of state capture all the time in Parliament and so on. And that is clearly where it is headed. But it has some pretty interesting proposals with regard to the details of how you do this with regard to institutions of state.
Well, Judy, thank you very much. I mean, as you conclude here, I just want to read what you wrote, which is that whether the politicians involved have sufficient steely determination to deal with the challenge will be seen after the 8th of May. After all, election time is a time of promises, but what South Africa really needs in relation to corruption is action. Thank you very much, Judith February. That's Judith February from the Institute of Security Studies. We're just looking at the three main parties, the ANC, the DA, and the EFF, what they've been saying in their manifestos around the issue of corruption, which is one of the major challenges our country faces.